In the spring of 1915, along the roads that stretched from Anatolia toward the Syrian desert, columns of civilians began to appear. They were not soldiers and they carried no weapons. They were families, farmers, merchants, teachers, priests, children, forced from their homes and directed south under military guard. The Ottoman Empire was in the midst of a global war, and suspicion toward one of its oldest Christian minorities had hardened into a policy of removal. What followed over the next several years would permanently reshape the Armenian presence in its historic homeland and become one of the most debated and studied tragedies of the 20th century. For centuries before 1915, Armenians had lived across eastern Anatolia and the South Caucasus. Their history in the region extended back more than 1,000 years, long predating the arrival of the Ottoman Turks. By the time the Ottoman Empire rose to power in the 15th and 16th centuries, Armenian communities were already deeply rooted in the towns and villages of the highlands. Under Ottoman rule, they were recognized as a religious community within the empire's system of governance known as the millet system. This arrangement allowed non-Muslim populations to maintain their churches, schools, and internal leadership, though they remained legally subordinate to the Muslim majority and subject to special taxes. Throughout much of Ottoman history, Armenian merchants, craftsmen, and professionals played important roles in urban life. In cities such as Constantinople, Smyrna, and Erzurum, Armenian communities developed strong cultural and religious institutions. Armenian printing presses, schools, and charitable networks expanded during the 19th century, a period when the Ottoman Empire itself was undergoing major reforms intended to modernize the state and create a more equal legal structure for its diverse populations. Yet the 19th century was also a period of growing instability for the empire. Nationalist movements were spreading throughout southeastern Europe, and several Christian populations under Ottoman rule began to seek independence. Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, and others eventually formed their own states after prolonged conflicts. These developments intensified anxiety among Ottoman authorities, who feared that further territorial losses could lead to the empire's collapse. Within eastern Anatolia, tensions between Armenian communities and some local Muslim populations grew increasingly complex. Economic competition, local disputes over land and taxation, and broader political changes created an atmosphere of distrust. Armenian political organizations emerged in the late 19th century, advocating reforms and greater protection for Armenians in the eastern provinces. At the same time, Ottoman officials worried that foreign powers, particularly Russia, might use Armenian grievances as a pretext for intervention. Violence periodically erupted during these years. In the 1890s, during the reign of Sultan Abdulhamid II, large-scale massacres of Armenians occurred across several provinces of the empire. Contemporary estimates suggested that tens of thousands of Armenians were killed during these events, which shocked international observers and deepened the sense of insecurity among Armenian communities. Though the empire survived the crisis, the relationship between Armenians and the Ottoman state had been fundamentally strained. In 1908, a group of reformist officers and intellectuals known as the Committee of Union and Progress seized power in what became known as the Young Turk Revolution. Initially, many Armenians welcomed the constitutional reforms promised by the new leadership. The restoration of the Ottoman constitution appeared to offer the possibility of greater equality among the empire's diverse populations. However, the optimism proved short-lived. The following years brought further turmoil. The Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913 resulted in massive territorial losses for the Ottoman Empire and forced hundreds of thousands of Muslim refugees into Anatolia. These refugees often arrived with traumatic memories of violence and displacement from the Balkans, adding to an already volatile atmosphere. Within the leadership of the Committee of Union and Progress, concerns about the empire's survival became increasingly urgent. When the First World War began in 1914, the Ottoman Empire entered the conflict on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary. The empire soon faced military confrontation with the Russian Empire along its eastern frontier, precisely in the region where many Armenians lived. Ottoman authorities grew increasingly suspicious that some Armenians might sympathize with Russia, particularly after a small number of Armenian volunteer units joined the Russian army. In early 1915, these suspicions hardened into a series of sweeping security measures. On April 24, 1915, Ottoman authorities arrested hundreds of Armenian intellectuals, clergy, and community leaders in Constantinople. Many of these individuals were deported to the interior of Anatolia and never returned. The arrests effectively removed much of the Armenian community's leadership and marked the beginning of a broader campaign of deportations across the empire. Soon afterward, orders were issued requiring the relocation of Armenian populations from eastern Anatolia to areas farther south, particularly the deserts of what is now Syria. The Ottoman government publicly justified these deportations as a wartime security measure, arguing that Armenian communities near the front posed a potential threat. However, the manner in which the deportations were carried out quickly led to catastrophic consequences. Armenian families were instructed to leave their homes with little notice. Many were allowed to carry only what they could transport by hand or by small carts. Entire villages were assembled and directed onto long routes that stretched hundreds of kilometers toward the interior of the empire. These convoys moved slowly under military supervision, often through harsh terrain and extreme climate conditions. Food and water were frequently scarce during the marches. Disease spread easily among groups weakened by exhaustion and hunger. In some areas, deportation routes passed through regions where banditry and violence were common, and the level of protection offered to the deportees varied widely. Reports from diplomats, missionaries, and other observers described widespread suffering along these routes as families struggled to survive the journey. By the summer and autumn of 1915, large numbers of Armenian deportees were arriving in camps and temporary settlements in the Syrian desert, particularly around locations such as Deir ez-Zor. Conditions in these areas were extremely difficult. Many of the displaced had already endured months of travel and had lost most of their possessions. Limited infrastructure, insufficient supplies, and disease created an environment where survival was uncertain. International observers recorded many accounts during this period. Diplomats from neutral countries, including the United States, sent detailed reports describing the deportations and their consequences. Missionaries working in the region documented the growing humanitarian crisis as displaced families attempted to find shelter and food in unfamiliar surroundings. Newspapers in Europe and North America published reports describing what was happening within the Ottoman Empire. Estimates of the total number of Armenians who died during the deportations and related events vary among historians, but most scholarly studies place the figure between several hundred thousand and over 1 million people. Deaths occurred through a combination of factors, including starvation, disease, exposure, and acts of violence along the deportation routes. Entire communities that had existed for centuries in eastern Anatolia were effectively removed. While these events unfolded, the Ottoman Empire itself continued to fight a desperate war on multiple fronts. By 1918, after 4 years of conflict, the empire collapsed along with its wartime allies. Allied forces occupied parts of Ottoman territory, and the political structure that had governed the empire for centuries came to an end. In the immediate aftermath of the war, a series of trials were held in Constantinople in which several former Ottoman officials were accused of responsibility for the deportations and killings. Some were convicted in absentia, as many leaders of the Committee of Union and Progress had already fled the country. These early legal proceedings attempted to establish accountability, though the political instability of the post-war years limited their long-term impact. Meanwhile, survivors of the deportations scattered across the Middle East, Europe, and the Americas. Armenian communities emerged in cities such as Beirut, Aleppo, Paris, Los Angeles, and Buenos Aires. Churches, cultural organizations, and schools helped preserve Armenian language and traditions among these diaspora populations. For many survivors and their descendants, memory of the events of 1915 became a defining element of community identity. The question of how to interpret these events has remained the subject of extensive historical research and international debate. Many historians and numerous governments describe the deportations and mass deaths of Armenians during the First World War as genocide, a term later defined in international law to describe the deliberate destruction of a national, ethnic, or religious group. The government of modern Turkey, which emerged from the remnants of the Ottoman